Thanks to the chair and the speaker. The second paper of this session, that will be by Manuel Amodo and Lara Meza from National University of Colombia, will take place here. But we're going to wait for the other audience to come into this hall. Right, so it's going to take 5 minutes maybe. And then that will be followed by vote of thanks. Thanks.
Amazing, beautiful place. And I want to especially thank to Ravi Prakash, because he, with all his help, we couldn't be here. And I want to thank you, Ravi. Well, we're going to talk about one of the most influential personalities in the analytical tradition of philosophy of education, who is Richard Peters. He's like a very representative figure in the analytical tradition. I would like to explain a little bit about what is the analytical tradition, what is about the analytical tradition. Maybe it will be very, very short because we have a lot of things to say, but the central idea maybe in the analytical tradition is to resolve some problems, some philosophical problems based on conceptual analysis, to try to clarify our questions before to try an answer. Many people say that this is like a romantic idea, because maybe the analytical tradition is sometimes viewed like a waste of time. But I really think that it's very important to make a clarification of concepts before we can try to answer these fundamental questions in philosophy of education, and in general in another study. So, as I say, one of the central figures in the philosophy of education in the 28th century is Richard Peters, who championed the most influential and controversial view of education in the analytical tradition. Peters is not only recognized by the unique rigor and detail of his particular analysis, but also by his insistence in the idea that a series of fundamental questions concerning educational practice can be solved once conceptual and linguistic questions have been solved. The objectives of this paper are, first, to present Peters' controversial view, known as the conception of education as initiation to a form of life. Second, to explain the distinction between education and indoctrination in a pejorative sense implied in his conception. And third, to propose a solution to the classic problems that, according to the critics, Peters' position faces. These problems are mainly two. The first problem is that the concept of education is dependent on the social context. Thus, any general conception of education, like Peters', will be incorrect, or at least only applicable to a narrow local context. In either case, Peters' analysis will be unable to account for a series of general and fundamental questions in the philosophy of education, like how to determine whether a person is well educated, how to figure out whether a practice is a genuine educational practice, or what ought to be learned or taught. And the second problem is that if Peters' analysis is true, there is a commitment with the idea that education involves forms of indoctrination in a pejorative sense. So, what I want to do is to present the analysis of education by Peters, just to try what are the source of this analysis. So it is possible to distinguish at least three different senses expressed in the everyday use of the term education. The first sense, and probably the broadest of the three, is a sociological sense. This sense is applied to all the practices involved in raising or nurturing people in a society. Those practices can be exercised in educational institutions, but they can also be developed in societies in which there are no formal schools. For example, societies where family plays a central role in the acculturation of the children. In this sense of education, it is irrelevant that the contexts acquired, like beliefs, doctrines, views, are false or unjustified. And it is irrelevant, that those practices do not make a contribution to the improvement of an individual person. Thus, in this sense, education is similar in meaning to terms like acculturation, socialization, or simply raising. For example, a sentence like this one, "He was educated like a Nazi," can appear as shocking due to the ambiguity of the term educated. But the content of the sentence can be more naturally expressed using another sentence like, "He was raised like a Nazi," in which it is suggested that a series of practices of socialization have been performed in or inspired by a Nazi ideology. The second sense of education can be a part of the first sense, but not completely equated with it. The second sense is an institutional sense of education and refers to program and organized processes and practices performed in a school or a similar formal institution. Quite often, this second sense of education is employed in sentences used to quantify or qualify the institutional educational processes and practices. For instance, consider a sentence like the following. She is in middle-level education, or he has spent more than 10 years in education, or more contemptuous ones like, "All these years of education have been a waste of time," in which there is an explicit or implicit reference to schooling, school, college, university, and so on. It seems there is, besides these two senses of education, a sense that, even though it's not as broader as the sociological one, makes sense of sentences like the one in the third option. Yes, the sentence is, "I passed school but did not get educated." It's a perfectly meaningful sentence. And this sentence would express a contradiction if understood in an institutional sense of education, but they are not obviously contradictory. So, another sense of education is required to fully comprehend their meaning. If understood in the sociological sense, the sentence would not express a contradiction, but someone who utters this sentence not necessarily is telling something about the raising or acculturation. Consequently, a third sense of education appears to be required to make sense of some meaningful utterance involving the word in question. This third sense of education may involve a general refinement or illustration that is not necessarily imparted in a school or part of a series of raising practices, at least not exclusively. It is precisely this sense of education, the main topic of discussion in the philosophical literature produced within the analytical tradition, and particularly Peter's controversial analysis. So, according to Peters, this third sense of education has to be understood in terms of an initiation to public and desirable forms of thought and action that can be articulated or described in language. The initiation described by Peters may involve forms of socialization, but is different from many of them because it requires that a person develops, in a conscious and deliberate way, mental states of broad knowledge and understanding, as well as appropriate emotional attitudes. To get a deep comprehension of Peters' analysis, it is convenient to present his proposal in terms of the punctual criteria that the analysis embodies. So the verb to educate, in the third sense, according to Peters, is an achievement verb. That is, the achievement verb is a term coined by the philosopher Gilbert Ryle. Well, to say that to educate is an achievement verb means the following two things, at least. In the first place, to educate does not denote a specific activity or set of activities, and therefore educating is not related necessarily to any specific activity. to educate is, for example, not necessarily to train or to instruct or another specific practice or transaction between students and teachers. Education is rather than a task, an achievement obtained by the proper execution of one activity or set of activities. In other words, it is possible to educate in many ways. For this reason, Peter used the term initiation. This term is general enough to encompass the different practices that can result in the education of a person. In the second place, it is not possible for a person that can, it is not possible for a person to get educated and fail in the same sense in which it is not possible to win a race and fail, although it is possible to run a race and fail. If someone managed to pass through the processes appropriate to get educated, she cannot fail. In conclusion, to educate, although does not denote a specific activity, it denotes a kind of achievement and the proper execution of some or another activity can help to obtain. According to Peters, the very sense of education provides a series of general criteria to determine what makes a practice a genuine or appropriate educational practice. In other words, the meaning of education provides criteria that a set of practices need to satisfy to obtain the achievement that the verb to educate denotes. These criteria are basically three: the value criterion, the knowledge criterion, and the procedural criterion. The value criterion says that education is a positive achievement. That is, what a person gets when she is educated is a series of desirable mental states and abilities. It is not possible that someone gets education in the sense in question, and this does not involve something good. So education is always something with value, something good. In this respect, to educate is similar to the verb rehabilitate. A person that is rehabilitated is a person that changes to a better or more valuable state than this original state. Following Peters, what determines the valuable mental states and abilities depends on the society as well as the educator. Thus, in a determined social context, it makes no sense to say that someone is educated to steal or to smuggle. Although all educational practice must be a desirable or valuable practice, this does not mean that every valuable or desirable practice is itself educational. Value is necessary for education, but not sufficient. Two other criteria besides value have to be put forward as being important to decide the educational quality of a given practice. The knowledge criterion is complex because it has more than one dimension: quantity, quality, variety, and what Peters calls cognitive perspective. Cognitive perspective is the ability first to establish links between the diversity of types of knowledge enjoyed, and second, to apply these types of knowledge to new situations or broader aspects of life. For example, someone exercises a cognitive perspective when applies an ability to appreciate the historic, the social, aesthetic, and economic signification of the diversity of knowledge acquired, and develops an integral worldview. According to Peters, the cognitive perspective captures the idea that the sense of education in question is not to training, which suggests a specialized domain of knowledge. So education is not a specialization of knowledge, it's something broad. Thus, expressions like educated as a philosopher, or educated as biologist, or educated as engineer, although meaningful, must be elucidated in terms of the institutional sense of education or in terms of the concept of training, but not in terms of this third sense of education. Education in the relevant sense is education simpliciter, or education as a whole. Finally, the third criterion of Peters' analysis, the procedural criterion, is meant to capture, together with the other two criteria, the idea that education is completely opposed to indoctrination. indoctrination in a pejorative sense. Indoctrination, so understood, involves the acceptance of beliefs and other changes in mental states without evidence and questioning due to at least partially a failure in giving reasons, an intentional falsification of evidence, or an unjustified claiming of irrefutability. Indoctrination, in this sense, is possible even in situations in which the inserted beliefs are true, like in brainwashing. Indoctrination is therefore indifferent with respect to the content of beliefs, but not with regard to the way they are acquired. They may be false, they may be true, but they may be indoctrinated because the way they are inserted. The knowledge criterion avoids that we judge a practice as educational if that practice allows the conscious, voluntary, but blind acquisition of beliefs. That is, beliefs whose believer incorrectly considered as irrefutable or is not capable to justify or to put in question. The procedural criterion, for its part, denies the educational character to any practice that forces the will or consciousness of an individual because, according to this criterion, an educational process or practice has to satisfy two conditions. On the one hand, the practice or process has to be such that the educator succeeds in both, transmitting to his pupil something valuable, and transmitting the very idea that what he teaches is valuable. On the second hand, the way in which the educator satisfies the first condition ought not to transgress the will or consciousness of the pupil. So notice that although the procedural criterion prescribes forms of conditioning and brainwashing, the procedural criterion does not prescribe some coercive methods like orders if there are good reasons for the application of those methods and it is possible for the student to resist and to reject the coercion. Peter's analysis has been a source of controversy inside and outside the analytical tradition in philosophy of education. In what follows, two of the classic objections to Peter's analysis will be critically examined and challenged. So, one of the objections to Peter's analysis has a really wider scope. The scope is to put in question any general analysis of the term education and its cognates. According to this objection, an enormous variety of social concepts, and probably all of them, are such that it is not possible a general agreement about its precise definition. The lack of agreement is due to the fact that every culture or society fabricates its own definition of a social concept. So a culture, society, or even a small group of interests can have a different concept of education that is not compatible with foreign concepts of education. Therefore, there will be, in principle, a disagreement about the concept of education. The disagreement cannot be overcome, critics say, because there is not an intercultural conceptual scheme and no fact of the matter that can be used to decide whether the concept of a particular culture is correct or wrong. A fatal consequence is that what in a culture is considered as a genuine educational practice, in a different culture can be considered as an incorrect educational practice or a bizarre one. And there is no rational intercultural method to decide which of the two cultures is right. This question simply doesn't apply. Any concept that, like the concept of education, behaves in the way described by this objection, that is dependent of a culture and there is no an intercultural conceptual scheme to prefer one version of a concept over others, is a strong context-dependent concept. So the objection runs as follows. The concept of education is a strong context-dependent concept, therefore any general analysis of the term is incorrect or just applicable to a very narrow context. If the above objection is sound and therefore the concept of education is a strong context-dependent concept, then Peter's analysis cannot pretend a general application. Peter's analysis cannot be an explanation of an intercultural concept of education but just, at most, an analysis of what a group of interests of some Western culture understands in regard to education. Following the objection, given that there is no justification to apply Peter's analysis beyond a small group of interests, the criteria offered by Peters cannot be used to recommend or to prescribe presumed educational practices, even inside a Western or very small context. Although it is true that there is no general agreement about the precise definition of the concept of education, as is shown by the endless philosophical discussions, we think there are no enough reasons to the conclusion that the concept of education is a strong context-dependent concept, as the objectors affirm. The reason is that the critics mistake the ambiguity and vagueness of the concept of education for the strong context dependence. We will try to show how the arguments commonly used to argue in favor of the strong context dependency only show, at most, what we will call a weak context dependence, a kind of dependence without the fatal consequence implied by a strong context dependence. In the first place, it must be stressed that from the fact that there is no general agreement about the precise meaning of education, it does not follow that the concept of education is a strong context-dependent concept. Lack of agreement can be explained in terms of vagueness. If a concept, even an interculturally shared concept, is vague, the limits of the concept are themselves vague. This means that in the case of the concept of education, there are borderline cases of educational practices. That is, cases such that we don't know or cannot know whether they fall under the concept and therefore whether they are cases of genuine educational practices. Some cultures can consider that a certain borderline cases are actually clear cases of educational practices, but this kind of considerations do not have to be considerations constitutive of the meaning of education for that culture. Thus, the vagueness of education will explain the lack of agreement without invoking a strong context dependence and without denying that the concept of education is interculturally shared. An analogy can be useful to understand the point made above. The term ball, for example, is vague due to the fact that we cannot know with absolute precision what are the limits of the concept. We don't know, for example, how many hairs someone must have to be considered as not bald, or how many hairs someone has to lose to be considered as bald. Discussing about that question will take us an eternity. There will be no general agreement about the precise limits of the concept. However, the fact that there is an essential imprecision in the concept of baldness and no general agreement about its application does not show that there is no central notion of what is a bald person interculturally shared. For example, a notion like someone who does not have hair in all or most of the scalp. So, the first objection to Peter's analysis has to invoke other reasons besides lack of agreement, vagueness, or ambiguity to reach its conclusion. So, it's often insisted that the strong context dependence of the concept of education is not just a direct consequence of the lack of agreement about its limits. It has to be added the fact that in many groups of people, even entire societies, what is considered as valuable or desirable varies substantially. However, this objection does not work because it does not reject the existence of an intercultural concept of education and does not attack the generality of Peter's analysis. The reason is that Peter's analysis does not say, and does not pretend to say, what specifically are the valuable contents or desirable mental states in a society. And there is no reason to think that the concept of education must include an explicit list of valuable contents and mental states. For example, suppose that in a given society playing poker, there is a card game, is esteemed as a valuable educational practice. The fact that in other societies poker is not considered as an educational practice does not show, thank you, does not show that the concept of education is a strong context-dependent concept. On the one hand, one of the two cultures can be viewed as employing the concept of training instead of the concept of education. On the other hand, it is perfectly possible a circumstance in which playing poker is immersed in a series of processes that satisfy the three criteria of Peter's analysis: value, knowledge, and procedure. Peter's analysis, as mentioned above, admits that education can be achieved in many different ways. A similar attack to Peter's analysis says that the strong context dependence of the concept of education follows from what is considered as educational practices and methods in other cultures. But the response to this attack is also similar to the previously given. It is possible that some cultures do not give any educational value to studying books, or that physics and history do not figure in their curriculum. Nonetheless, this does not show a strong context dependence, but difference in methods and content. Difference that are still compatible with the intercultural correctness of Peter's analysis. In a given culture, some contents can be favored over others. A bizarre hierarchy of knowledge can coexist with an appreciation of the quantity, quality, variety, and cognitive perspective of that knowledge. It can be insisted that there is or is possible a society in which the valuable contents, independently of what these contents are imparted, breaking the knowledge criterion and the second condition of the procedural criterion about the will and consciousness of the student. This society will be like the one described by George Orwell in his famous novel 1984, but to show real or imaginary examples of this kind of society is not to show a strong context dependence, because those fictional or real societies can be described as employing incorrect concept of education, or societies in which that concept is not understood. The content of education can change according to the sentence in which it appears, but these variations can be explained in terms of the ambiguity of the word or in terms of what we call weak context dependence. A verb like to cut expresses a weak context-dependent concept in the following sense: the content of to cut changes according to the sentence in which it appears, because the word does not have the same meaning in to cut the grass as in the to cut the pie. Different things are involved in those actions. This is not a case of an ambiguity, but at most a case of context dependency. However, it does not mean that to cut expresses a strong context-dependent concept. It is possible that it expresses a concept common to all contextual variations, a concept that will be augmented according to the sentential context. This context dependency is weak because all contexts will have a common content. For example, all the uses of the cut can have a core meaning, like to divide with a sharp edge, contrary to what occurs in the strong context dependency. The same can be said mutatis mutandis in the case of to educate. Maybe there are contextual variation of the meaning of educate, but maybe all those variations have a core content that is interculturally shared. The second classic objection against Peters affirms that the notion of initiation involves indoctrination in a pejorative sense. Thus, Peters is wrong, or the concept of education involves forms of indoctrination. But the last option is unacceptable. There is like an intuitive belief that education must be separated completely from indoctrination. Like education is not compatible with indoctrination. Therefore, Peter's analysis is wrong according to the critics. The teaching of propositional knowledge, physics, biology, math, logic, etc., they say always involves blind acquisition of beliefs, so always involve indoctrination. The principles of this knowledge, physics, biology, math, logic, are learned without justification. Given that blind acquisition of beliefs is contrary to the knowledge criterion, Peters is wrong or admits indoctrination in a pejorative sense. And anyway, he is wrong. The idea that education is opposed to indoctrination in a pejorative sense, and anyway, the idea that education is opposed to indoctrination has been used to prescribe the teaching of some content. For example, according to a well-known argument, the religious education, in Western cultures at least, is not a genuine educational practice because it implies the blind acquisition of beliefs. If Peter's critics are right, arguments against the educational merits of content based on indoctrination consideration, like the one mentioned above, will not have any force. But, independently of the force of these arguments, we think that, contrary to its critics, Peter's analysis does not involve indoctrination in a pejorative sense. In general terms, our suggestion consists in making a distinction between pure indoctrination pure indoctrination pure indoctrination and methodological indoctrination. Pure indoctrination involves that students accept some propositions with no evidence and no chance to evaluate or to put in question those same propositions. This is indoctrination in a pejorative sense. Methodological indoctrination, although involves that a subject acquires some principles with no evidence, is different from pure indoctrination in two aspects. First, in methodological indoctrination, blind acquisition of beliefs or principles is not an end, but a medium to construct a theory or to explain phenomena. And second, methodological indoctrination, contrary to pure indoctrination, involves the provision of tools and techniques to open the possibility to eventually put in question or to reject on a rational basis, empirical evidence, or a priori argumentation, the principles initially acquired. So, for example, teaching logic involves methodological indoctrination insofar as basic principles. Thank you. The teaching logic involves methodological indoctrination insofar as basic principles are presented without justification, like the axioms of classic sentential logic, but with the intention to construct a theory of valid inference and to give the elements to eventually critically evaluate those principles. Even the principles of logic can be revisited and modified. Non-classic logics are examples of that. Similarly, the teaching of the rest of the sciences can be imparted in processes that include methodological but not pure indoctrination. If Peter's analysis is modified to include methodological indoctrination but not pure indoctrination, it is possible to avoid the second objection to Peter's analysis. Methodological indoctrination does not include the pejorative aspects of pure indoctrination and therefore makes Peter's analysis compatible with the idea that education is opposed to indoctrination in a pejorative sense. In conclusion, although Peter's analysis is far from perfect, the two classic objections that question the possibility of that analysis are not sound. The first one cannot show that the concept of education is a strong context-dependent concept. So, it cannot show that a general and intercultural analysis of the concept of education is not possible. And the second objection fails to see a distinction between two types of indoctrination. Only one of these types, pure indoctrination, will be a problem for Peter's analysis. But actually, Peter's conception of education is not committed with pure indoctrination, but at most with methodological indoctrination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Do you mind if I ask you one question before we... I'd just like to ask you one question before we turn it over to the floor. The idea of homeschooling in America, parents educating or parents teaching their children at home for one reason or another. If you apply Peters's analysis, where do you see that kind of education that doesn't have the social context and so on?
Yeah, that's actually it seems like a borderline case of educational practice, because it's not as formalized like an institutional, but it certainly has like a curriculum. When children are educated in their homes, maybe they follow like a curriculum.
Where's the context, the sociology?
Yeah, maybe this can be like an interesting case, because it involves an element of institutional sense of education, but also an element of a sociological sense of education. The idea is actually not that we can differentiate all of the cases and to make a classification of them. Just the idea is to clarify the most relevant concept of education. Actually, Peters thought that the third sense of education, the sense of initiation to a form of life, is the concept that allows us to evaluate an educational practice.
Because sometimes people keep their children at home because they don't want them to be someplace else. Like maybe there's too much diversity in the school district, and they just prefer their children to be not socialized in that way. Is that indoctrination in a way?
No, not necessarily, because the indoctrination involves to insert beliefs with no justification or with no tools or techniques to put into question eventually those principles or beliefs imparted.
It's just indoctrination dressed up in another way.
Indoctrination involves, in that case, indoctrination will be like the insertion of beliefs with no critical basis.
Okay. We have questions. Okay, so Chris, we just take one at a time. Is that your preference? Chris?
Thank you. Yes, this is a skillful defense of a Peter's position at a certain time, but I wonder what you think of the fact that Peters did change his views about the nature of education quite drastically. So by the time he wrote Essays on Educators, published in 1982, he seemed to be committed to a view of education which, on the one hand, admitted there was a categorical concept of preparation for adult life in something worthwhile, but also admitted that there were particular conceptions of education, following W.B. Gally's analysis of contested concepts, which suggested that you could have a conception of education which was quite radically different from someone else's, and that would be connected with the idea that different communities have very different conceptions of the worthwhile. And if Peter's later view is right, then it seems it's much less easy to draw a neat distinction between education and indoctrination, and even pejorative indoctrination. So I just wondered whether you think that Peter's earlier position is the one that he should have kept to and shouldn't have slid away to a more relativistic point of view.
Yeah, you're right. Peters changed his mind. He seems to admit that education is unavoidable. Is a contested concept, or a context, or a strong context-dependent context. But when he maintains that view, he cannot avoid the critique that the concept of education is a relativistic one. Like, you cannot solve some fundamental questions that all of we thought can be interculturally shared. So the idea of this paper is like to, yes, defend some of the Peter's conceptions, but also to attack this posterior manner to think. I think that Peters can be defended from himself. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the concept, as you say, that methodological indoctrination. I just came up with an example. What if a religious community is saying, okay, we are giving religious education as a means to achieve some sort of like the kids learn how to appreciate the spiritual aspect of life or religious aspect of life, and they might have a conception of this like this is of higher value than other sort of education. So it seems to be a means to something else, and I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, the argument against the religious education is aimed to a specific concept of religious education. Is the religious education that involves no critical examination of the principles or beliefs imparted, but it's not aimed to, for example, theological class or a class where is teach that there are religious beliefs that can improve even the life of the people. But the idea is that the education that involves maybe religious or another content, the education that involves indoctrination in the pejorative sense are not a good educational practices. If there are no rational basis, evidence, or the possibility to eventually to put into question those principles, so this argument says that there is no a genuine educational practice.
Questions? Yes. Yes, go ahead.
It seems as though there are counterexamples to the value criterion. It seems that it makes sense to say education leads to cynicism. Education leads to loss of faith. Education leads to suicide. Why should education necessarily have to meet a positive value standard?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, the point about values is a big point, because there are too many controversies around the very same concept of value. But the idea is to capture the intuitive idea that we have about education, that education is something that is good. No one, there are many people that maybe doesn't agree, but maybe they can revisit the concept of education, but know to explain our concept. There is a very beautiful distinction made by Peter Strawson about the decision is that there is a kind of metaphysic that is descriptive, and there is a metaphysic that is revisionist. The idea of Peter's, I think, is to describe this concept that is maybe it's not maintained by everyone, but it's maintained by many people. And this concept is a concept of the value, involves the value of education. When people criticize this concept, maybe they are making a revision of the concept. Like, this is a concept of education, but maybe education leads to suicide or to make people unhappy. But the idea of Peters is just to describe this concept, not to revisit the concept.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just a small remark. I'm not sure whether you can talk even about methodological indoctrination, at least at earlier Peters. Then, soon as you are showing alternatives, there's no room for indoctrination anymore. Indoctrination would be a teaching of some beliefs without showing alternative ways to see the matters, the alternative, without showing alternative perspectives. But this seems to me to contradict the principle of cognitive perspective, which is for Peters the aim of education, because to develop a cognitive perspective means precisely to be aware that your perspective is only one possible way to see the things in the world. So why do you need this distinction between a pure indoctrination and methodological indoctrination, there's no need, I think, of a concept of methodological indoctrination, at least with regard to Peters or to the earlier Peters.
Yeah, thank you. It has to be with the value criterion, because if you allow indoctrination, pure indoctrination, if in your concept of education, the concept of education cannot anymore be a positive concept, because we have this idea that indoctrination is not a good idea, like these societies like the one depicted by Orson Welles in 1984. You go to the room 101 and you think that 2 + 2 = 5, and it's okay according to them. It's an intuitive belief that cannot be education. Education cannot be like that. So education seems to me has to be opposed to indoctrination. So the role of methodological indoctrination is to make compatible the idea that yes, in education sometimes blind acquisition of beliefs is necessary, but is not an end. Because, for example, my favorite example is with logic. When you learn logic, you have to learn a lot of principles, basic principles, the law of no contradiction, for example, that initially are not put into question. Just they say the law of no contradiction is just a law, it's not refutable. But that is something like an indoctrination, because you cannot put into question the principle. But if logic logic is part of a practical practice, an educational practice, sorry, you have to make room to question those principles, to say, yes, the law of no contradiction allows us to make a theory of valid inference, but eventually you can put into question the very same principle of no contradiction. So that would be a non-pejorative indoctrination in the teaching of logic. Thank you.
I have the formal last word in the conference, and that's a privilege. And I would like to begin by saying that we have come to the end of 3 days of quite animated, vibrant and fruitful set of discussions and presentations, and I am quite sure that you will all agree with me that that we feel a general sense of gratitude that such a forum exists. And I would like to express that first on behalf of some of us who have been directly the beneficiaries of that, the presenters and the participants. So thank you, and thanks to all the participants who are here now and who have been part of it for 3 days. But a seminar or a conference like this is successful because of a large number of people, individuals, who are invisible in the conference itself. It is to them that I would like to name some of them specifically and express gratitude on behalf of the university, the organizers, and I'm sure all of us who are here. Firstly,